a lot of you probably noticed these protests in Hong Kong, and I have one picture to show you. This is a massive protest in Hong Kong, and I want to just tell you why this protest is happening, why this entire rebellion is happening. Hong Kong has a unique kind of political identity. It was passed over from the British to the Chinese in a kind of protectorate mode where Hong Kong was to remain relatively autonomous for 50 years, 50 years. And then, I think it's in 2047, Hong Kong is supposed to then surrender that autonomy and become part of China. The point is, Hong Kong has lived pretty much under freedom for a long, long time. If you see the size of this crowd, I'm going to tell you about crowd size in this protest in Hong Kong. Hong Kong had in the streets, and Hong Kong's just one big city. Hong Kong had in the streets 2 million protesters. The country only has, or the protectorate, Hong Kong, only has 7 million people. We're talking about massive protests in the streets. What they're protesting is a proposed law that the government, if you want to call it that, in Hong Kong, and it's not really in a government in the sense of what we think of governments. The leader of Hong Kong is actually referred to as a chief executive, and this woman is a loyalist to China. She's there to follow, to implement China's policies in Hong Kong, and China wanted to have a new extradition law in place. To be precise, they wanted a law in place that made it unquestionable that if China wanted to prosecute someone who's in Hong Kong would agree to send that person up to China for the prosecution. And this is an extradition treaty. We have them in many countries. We agree that we'll turn over people they want to prosecute, and they turn over people that we want to prosecute. But the people in China are having none of it. This protest began because people were arguing that China, where they have no human rights, no civil rights, no free speech, people are concerned in Hong Kong that things they have been free to do, free to say in their lives in Hong Kong will become the subject of Chinese accusation and potential prosecution. They're concerned they'll lose their free speech rights if they speak up in Hong Kong and say, down with communism, down with Xi Jinping, anything, whatever they would say, down with Huawei, whatever they would say. They're worried that people in Hong Kong will be sent up to China for prosecution. And in China, to be clear, you can't think of the criminal justice system in the way you think of America's criminal justice system, where we actually have protections. We have some sense that justice usually emerges. When you're a Chinese government and you are the dictator, you really are the law. The system, they have characters in place called judges and laws in place that are called the statutes, but pretty much the Chinese party, Communist Party, is in charge, and everyone in Hong Kong knows that. So they're very worried about losing their free speech rights. And they actually talked about, people were interviewed on the streets of Hong Kong, why are you protesting? Why is it such a big deal to have an extradition treaty? One of them said, because China is going to trump up charges. They're just going to make up stuff to force us to be flown up to China to be prosecuted. So they had this protest start, and it was kind of interesting. I want to share a little bit about how the leader reacted to this protest. She was not happy. She thought she was in charge, rocking along, and going to force this issue through, that they were going to have the extradition treaty. However, when the protest started, this woman's name is Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong. She started, her first reaction, her first public statement was to express sympathy to the crowd. Hey, you're kind of really upset about this. Trying to placate the masses, telling them, thanks for marching, appreciate your participation, blah, blah, trying to just put them down and ignore them, placate them with praises. That didn't work. The protesters flooded the main streets. Police opened fire with tear gas and rubber bullets. Then this chief executive, Carrie Lam, changed her tactics, and she scolded the demonstrators, comparing them to fussy children. Don't be fussy children. Don't act like a little kid and protest just because a new law is going to come in place. So the crowd got so big, they surrounded the building where the whatever they call their legislature meets, so they couldn't even have the discussion about whether or not to pass this law, which is really, yes, they have the right to say yes or no, but everyone recognizes China intends to take over Hong Kong, and this was a step along the way for China to assert its control over Hong Kong. So now, finally, Carrie Lam has agreed that to put the consideration of this extradition law on hold. So where we stand today is it's on hold, but the protesters are still not placated, still will not back down. Now they're saying she has to go, Carrie Lam has to go, and the law must be permanently pushed away, permanently removed. We're not going to have that law in this country. We're not going to have this law that is going to say essentially that China can decide when they want to bring anyone in Hong Kong they want up to China for prosecution. One of the interesting things that emerged about this was that there is no one specific leader of this big movement in Hong Kong. There are actually 50 different demonstrator groups that banded together. So there's not one person they can jail or arrest or criticize or do whatever they would do to him. They've got actually a group thing going on, and the name of the group is the Civil Human Rights Front. Civil Human Rights Front, made up of 50 groups. Some of the groups are flat out pure, we want independence, we're not ever going to be part of China. There are a lot of pro-democracy, demanding democracy, even in China, wanting China to open up and not be so dictatorial and tyrannical. So, I'm going to close out this story about Hong Kong today just to say, this is the human spirit. This is a great thing. Countries in the world, all over the world, should be supporting the Hong Kong protesters, because what they're really protesting is not just this particular extradition law, this proposed law that might force them to be sent up to China and prosecuted in some, mockery of a serious trial, mockery of justice kind of trial, sent away to one of China's gulags, never heard from again, which is what these people actually really worry about in Hong Kong. They know what China's like, and China's justice system just deserves no respect, and they don't want to have to be part of it. So it's a protest against the extradition law, but in a larger way, it's a protest against the very idea of communism and socialism, a protest against the very idea that people have to live the way the people in communist China have to live. This is a protest about freedom. It's a protest against tyranny, against repression, against what China represents to the world. So there's great value for countries in this world to speak up in protest. So when China wants to do business all over the world, wants to have a contract with some other country, with their Huawei 5G or whatever it is they're trying to get a contract to do, other countries need to be standing up against China. They need to be saying to China, you need to back off from Hong Kong. Leave them alone. They don't want your laws. They don't want to be part of your system. Leave them alone. The more countries that more publicly put pressure on China, the better it is, not just to protect the Hong Kongers, as they're called, from this extradition law, but the larger sense of the world community standing up in favor of freedom and against the communist regime in China that is, as you would know, if you listened to my show a few weeks ago, we had Gordon Chang on the show talking about China is trending repressive. China is not moving toward freedom. They're moving toward more authoritarianism. In fact, Gordon Chang in the show used the word that China is actually trending not just toward authoritarianism, but actual flat-out totalitarianism. The world needs to push back in favor of freedom. It's a great window on the human spirit to watch the people in Hong Kong. They don't want to be controlled by China. Frankly, the Chinese people don't want to be controlled by the Chinese government, but they don't seem to have a way out yet.